Women's football loves a comeback. I mean, why wouldn't we? The first match back, a standing ovation, the social media posts. The moment is important, it matters, and it certainly should. It should be celebrated. However, what we don't discuss in women's football, and sometimes football in general, is what happens after that moment, after the applause, after the celebration. The way we frame comebacks might actually be creating unnecessary pressure and expectations for players returning from serious injuries, some being out for weeks and some even months. In women's football, a comeback isn't the happy ending to the story. It's sometimes actually the hardest part. So what do we mean by a comeback? When we say a player has come back, what does it actually mean? Not that they're fully fit, not that they're back at their best, not even that they're mentally ready. We usually just mean they've played again. They're on the pitch. We finally see them again after a prolonged period away. The problem is that the term comeback has actually almost become a binary label. People view it as either you're injured or you're back. That's it. However, as we know, recovery doesn't actually work that way. There are phases, there are setbacks. There can be huge changes in a player's role, the rhythm, and sometimes we even see a drastic difference with how a player plays. However, saying that, once we know a player is back, the conversation changes immediately. Expectations return, comparisons, and patience often disappears quickly. Patience that was there when the player was away. Now let's discuss the physical reality of a comeback. Medical clearance is not the same as match readiness. We have seen this play out repeatedly, especially with players like Vivianne Miedema. She is a prime example of this. Her return to football wasn't rushed, and yet even with careful management, her minutes fluctuated, as did her sharpness. That wasn't a failure of recovery. That was a reality of returning to football after injury. The same is true for Fran Kirby, especially during the early stages of her career. Players can be medically cleared, but might still need months to rebuild their confidence in movement, acceleration, and even decision-making on the pitch. Yet once we see their name in the team lineup, we stop talking about process and instead start judging outcome and performance. I believe this is kind of where the danger lies. In many cases, the highest risk for re-injury isn't during the rehab process, it's actually during return to the game. This is obviously when load increases and players are desperate to prove to themselves that they belong in the team. However, when a player does return after a comeback, the conversation just immediately shifts to their performance. Not progression, not management, simply their performance. Now let's talk about the psychological pressure of a comeback. Now this is discussed much less. When a player comes back after injury, they're often surrounded by so much support, especially from their fans. Clubs are also backing them, discussing their resilience, their hard work during rehab, and fans of course are praising the return of players they love and have missed. However, support can often turn into expectation, and this is where the danger lies. Players like Fran Kirby have discussed how returning from injury doesn't mean returning without fear, especially when expectation returns faster than confidence does. We should also discuss the weight of being a symbol of the game. Comebacks can become inspirational content. We see it all the time on TikTok and YouTube. This is great, but at the same time, it becomes much harder for the player that's come back from injury to say, yes, I'm back, but I'm still not quite okay. It honestly doesn't leave too much room for honesty. That is the problem here. Now let's talk about the professional cost, and this is something we don't discuss enough. This is where women's football becomes vulnerable and how it differs to a male environment. Women's football operates with shorter contracts, smaller squads, less rotation, and fewer safety nets. So a player returning from injury isn't just fighting for fitness and form, they're actually fighting timing as well. Let's just look at how the environment changed when Leah Williamson was out. Squads evolved, roles shifted, systems adapted. I think we saw that backline change many times. Returning didn't mean stepping back into the same version of the team she left. It meant re-entering a moving environment. And like I said, in women's football, being out for such a long time, contracts ultimately expire, competition increases, and squads evolve while the injured player is sidelined. And obviously once you're back from injury, the clock just keeps ticking. If a player doesn't immediately return to form after injury, the grace period can be surprisingly short. Now, this isn't because the club is cruel or heartless and pushing the player to unrealistic expectations. It's simply because the structural realities don't allow long windows to adapt, and that is a problem. Ultimately, we celebrate the return without acknowledging the professional risk that follows. So why does women's football romanticize a comeback more than most? Let's discuss that. Ultimately, why does this narrative persist? This is ultimately because women's football has had to fight so hard and so long for visibility. Comebacks are emotional human stories, and partly because injuries have become so prominent, especially ACL injuries like I've discussed in a previous video, and partly because success stories are easier to tell than complicated ones. We ultimately compress recovery into a highlight reel moment. One match, one image, one caption. I mean, just look at the return of Leah Williamson. The image, the video, her returning to the pitch, it was everywhere. Alexia Putellas as well. She returned to the pitch in 2023 after being on the sidelines for 10 months after an ACL injury. These moments are powerful and of course they deserve celebration. What gets lost in the conversation though is uneven performances, managed minutes, and the gradual rebuild it takes to get back to that top form again. Some players don't ever get back to that top form, depending on the injury. Now, what could a better conversation look like? What would ultimately happen if we stopped treating comebacks like a happy ending? We might instead switch to language like phases instead of finishes, load management instead of minutes, and contribution instead of output. We might normalize seasons that are uneven or transitional after injury. We might even stop framing a comeback as resilience and instead acknowledge how fragile this stage actually is. And more importantly, we might actually make a space for players to come back without being expected to be the exact same player they were before injury. Because let's face it, many players get injured and are never the same player they were before injury. We see it so many times with ACL injuries, which is a horrific injury. Some players are never the same again, and there has to be some grace there. So ultimately, when a player comes back from injury, I think we need to stop looking at it as the happy ending. We need to start rephrasing things such as, is their comeback successful? Is their performance the same as it was before they were injured? Instead, we just need to give them some grace and accept there is no firm ending after injury. It's not just that they're back and that's it. This is a process. And one of the biggest parts is a psychological process. So instead of setting these expectations for a player after comeback, we just need to give them the space to return. In the coming weeks, I want to focus on specific player stories surrounding this kind of topic, maybe even players such as Beth Mead, because the comeback is only the beginning, and women's football deserves to be honest about what comes next. Let me know your thoughts about all of this in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.